Five, four, three, two, one. Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I am delighted to welcome back Carlos Eduardo Espina, our good friend, immigration activist, social media entrepreneur. It's so good to see you, Carlos. How are you?
No, I'm really excited to be back. Obviously can't say I'm doing 100% great because there's so many things going on, but I mean, we're taking it day by day, so here we are.
Exactly. There was a raid in Chicago that I really think should shock the conscience of all Americans. People were pulled out of an apartment building. Children were naked. Children were put in zip ties. What do you make of this? And is this kind of the look at things to come? Should we fear that this is now like the standard operating procedure?
Yeah, I mean, this is the worst part of everything that's going on. I tell people for many months we prepared what's going to happen when ICE knocks at your door, when this happens, you don't know your rights, this and that, don't open the door if they don't have a warrant. It seems like none of that matters anymore, and unfortunately, no one's upholding the law. I mean, if you look at what they did in this raid, it's totally unconstitutional, but then the question becomes, okay, who's going to make them respect the Constitution? Unfortunately, it seems like the courts have given a green light. The federal government's obviously not going to hold their own accountable. I mean, it's just a very dire situation. And, early on in the administration, there was still a lot of people buying oh, they're going after the gangsters and the criminals and all this. Now people are starting to see, or a lot more people are starting to see straight through it. I mean, that's what they're saying. Yeah, we went after these gangsters and this, but no one's really believing it anymore. Obviously, there's people in the Trump base who still are riled up, and yes, the gangsters. But when you have people who are U.S. citizens coming out and talking to the press and saying, hey, they were, handcuffing kids and taking them out of their apartment and then separating us by color. I mean, what's going on here? This is just, I mean, this is insane to put it any other way. So it is really worrying. And my question is, when does this all end? I'm hopeful that we'll have a big showing in the midterms. People will finally put an end to all this madness. But I also worry, that is that too far away? What's going to happen between now and next November? How much damage is going to be done? So, like I said at the beginning, I can't say I'm doing too well because this is all very frightening.
It really is. And, the Supreme Court has kind of, whether intentionally or not, kind of green lighted all of this. So they basically said you can go and racial profile, you can go in and on really skimpy evidence and go ahead and conduct these sorts of raids. In the communities, are people afraid? Are they angry? What's kind of the dominant emotion, or is it a mix of things?
Yeah, so what we're seeing a lot of right now, which is very interesting, is this dynamic where people are like very worried, but at the same time they're very engaged with the news, for example. So you see all these things happening in Chicago, and people are like, in a way, I feel kind of relieved that I don't live in Chicago. So I live, but the question then becomes, when is this that's going on in Chicago going to come to other places? Because when you have the president saying, "Oh, we're using Chicago as a testing ground," or whatever the term that he used, that keeps people on edge. Okay, now it's happening in Chicago, and I empathize and I worry for the people in Chicago. I am happy I don't live in Chicago, but this isn't going to end in Chicago. So that's the big worry that people have, the extent of this, how far is this going to go? When you see that they were just walking around Millennium Park and took families and kids, I mean, like, people start to look around and really wonder, where does this all end? Where's this all going to lead to? And, what has this country even become? Because I think when you talk about immigrants and why they're here in the United States, sure, there's economic reasons and this and that, but there's many people who are in this country because of the freedoms, the liberties, the things they can enjoy here that they couldn't enjoy in their home country. So when you start seeing masked agents and almost military grade equipment, flashbanging doors down and, entering by force, you wonder, is this even America anymore? And I think that's the question a lot of us are grappling with right now, which is very sad to say because, you know, many people, especially older than I am, they say, "Hey, I've lived through Democrat and Republican administrations, but I never doubted, the strength of America, the values of America. I might have disagreed with one president or another, but this is getting to a whole nother extreme that is really, sad to see."
Exactly. And you make such a good point that people say, well, it's in Chicago or it's in DC or it's in LA or it's in Portland. But what we're seeing is that once they feel like they can do it one place, they do it every place. How do you talk to people and keep them engaged, give them some hope that their political involvement is going to make things better, is going to help stop this.
Yeah, so I think there's a big misconception, right? That, oh, if you persecute immigrants, it's not going to really change any voting patterns because immigrants can't vote. But the reality is, we are very interconnected communities. All of us, those who are citizens like myself, like you and I, and those who aren't, a lot of undocumented people have family members, they have friends, they have neighbors, they have coworkers, people who have never really thought about the immigration issue, but now they see their friend, getting raided at a workplace site at a workplace, and they're saying, okay, what the hell's going on here? So, I think they're overstepping. I'm going to be frank on the issue of immigration. They think, oh, because these people don't matter, these people can't vote, these people aren't citizens, no one cares about how cruel we are to them. But I think that's a very big misconception. I think the average American with empathy, the average American who cares about their neighbor, their friends, their coworkers, is seeing a lot of this stuff going on and saying, okay, hey, look, I agree with, getting out the criminals, the gangsters, those who have done wrong, but this is going way too far, arresting families and kids at Millennium Park and, assaulting women at immigration courts. I mean, I would think every decent human being has that threshold. And I think, they're really pushing the limits. And I think they're also aware of that. If you look at the discourse, they're really trying to push hard. We're going after gangsters. I mean, they're really stick on their message. But at the same time, people are seeing right through it because the reality is you can't hide the truth. I mean, especially now with social media, and that's what I give a lot of props to JB Pritzker. I think he's really on the dot when he said, what we need people is people who are filming and who are documenting all these things because there's the official narrative and then there's what's really going on. And unless we have brave people who are, filming, which you shouldn't really be brave for filming because that's a constitutional right, right? But now in the times we're living, it is a risk you're putting yourself in. But thanks to those videos, that content that's come out, we've been able to say, hey, the government says they're going after the worst of the worst, but the reality is a completely different story.
That is absolutely true. I mean, if not for telephones and cameras and citizens, the overwhelming, dominant, contradicted narrative would be, oh, they're just going after criminals. I want to shift just a little bit to Texas, where you are. Obviously, the president made this power play and is forcing to redistrict, trying to remove districts that have had Democrats and, frankly, deprive Latinos and Blacks of voting power.
Mm.
What's been the result there? Are people more engaged? Are people less engaged? Do you think there'll be a backlash in Texas?
Yeah, well, I think the Republicans and Trump have gotten really good at, making issues out of things that, the average person doesn't understand. So the biggest issue I've had is like explaining to people how basic congressional districts work because they see like, oh, they're changing the districts. What's wrong with that? And people who are in politics 24/7, we know the
Yes.
how hard this is. But I think that there's a reason why Donald Trump wants to defund education and go after universities. So a lot of us
Yeah.
who are community leaders, the work we're doing right now is actually getting people to understand what exactly this means for them. And I think when you do explain it, the question then becomes, why are they doing this? I mean, and so it's almost as an insult. So I think it's one of these situations that, yes, it's a very complicated and very negative thing that they're doing, but it can backfire on them too. And especially in Texas, if you look at the new districts that they made, they assume in the vast majority that the people are going to vote how they voted in the last elections, the last presidential election. There's even a lot of really big Latino districts, which they redistricted to be like Trump plus 10, plus 15. But that's assuming Latinos vote in the same way that they voted for Trump in 2024, which goes back to the issue of immigration, the economy. There's a very few Latinos, that I encounter day to day that are happy. There's people who say, "Hey, I voted for Trump and I'm not satisfied." Now they don't always say, "Hey, that means I'm going to vote Democrat," but I think Trump is really overstepping, and the polls show it. I mean, I have obviously my experiences can be anecdotes, but the polling shows that, the vast majority of Latinos who, supported or were sympathetic towards Donald Trump are now starting to be like, "Hey, okay, maybe this guy wasn't what we thought." And it boils down to one simple issue. He said he was going to make the economy better, things were going to get better. And now he's worried about every other issue except, fixing the economy. So the working person who pays attention to politics maybe 20 minutes a day turns on the news and says, hey, my grocery prices are through the roof, and this guy's talking to the generals at the army about fat generals and this. I mean, this guy's completely lost the plot. I think that's the narrative. So I think, the work needs to be done, of course, but I think there is a lot of ground to gain. And these five districts that they're so sure that they're going to win in Texas, I wouldn't be so sure about it, especially we have very strong candidates like Bobby Pulido. I'm sure you saw that he announced recently he's running in the Valley. I mean, there's hope. I'm going to say it's obviously harder than it was a couple months back before the redistricting, but it's not a lost cause.
I think you're exactly right. They've created these five safe, districts, but they've made themselves vulnerable because if people turn out to vote and people see what's going on, um, do you think, I'm curious about people in your age bracket and younger. Are younger people becoming, you think, more aware, more engaged because they see this, they see people being taken away, they see what it's doing to their, job prospects? Because the younger generation has always been kind of up and down in voting, and you really need those people to turn out, particularly in a midterm election.
Yeah, so there was a big conversation, right, about is the new generation becoming far right and this, and that. And I think a lot of it boiled down, we could get into the reasons why so many young people voted for Donald Trump. Maybe some thought he was funny, he was cool, they liked the whole podcast stuff, all of that thing. But at the end of the day, many people, didn't live through the first Trump administration. People younger than I did. I mean, for example, I'm
Yes.
26 years old, and my political formation was when I was a senior in high school, Donald Trump was elected. So all through college, I had that first year of Trump, which is why the reason that, when he ran again, I was so opposed to him because I remember that. Whereas a lot of the younger people who voted for Trump for the first time, they don't have that core memory. Their core memories were the pandemic, and they associate it with very negative things. And they say, hey, well, I heard that, things were better when Trump was president, so let me vote for Trump to see how better things were. And now I think a lot of them are waking up and being like, okay, maybe, those people who are a little bit older than us and lived through that first administration, they weren't exaggerating when they said that this guy is deranged, when they said that this guy is a threat, to our country. So the question then becomes, on the Democrat side, people are young people, they're not happy, they're not living up to, Trump's not living up to their expectations, but at the same time, what can the Democrats do to win them and flip them over? Because what I'm worried is a lot of young people saying, okay, politics sucks, presidents suck, this is all trash, I'm not going to engage in this. And I think that's very dangerous. So I think, our side, Democrats, progressives, whatever you lay in the big tent of ideas that we have, we need to do a better job of reaching those young people and saying, hey, I know you voted for Trump for X, Y, and Z reason. They're valid reasons because you want to buy a house, you want to pay rent, you want to do all these things. But Democrats are the ones who can help get you there, as opposed to the Republican Party, which has now been co-opted by Donald Trump.
Well, I think that's such a great point that people shouldn't assume simply because they voted for Trump last time that they're MAGA or that they're pro-Trump permanently,
Yeah.
and that there is an opportunity here. Who in Texas do you look to among the Democrats who's getting it right? Who do you see? And you say, that person, they're doing the right thing, they're kind of saying the right thing. Are there politicians that you in particular admire and can look to as kind of setting the right tone, the right message?
Yeah, well, one guy I've always been a big fan of, I don't think we need to talk much about him, has always been Beto O'Rourke. If you look at the numbers, he was the closest one to flipping any sort of statewide race. And the reason was because he understands Texas. He understands at the end of the day, whether you live in a big city or a small city, Texans have that same mentality of, we want to meet the people we're working with. We want to meet our politicians. We want to be met where we're at. We have that small town mentality, and he's the guy who ran up and down the state and people didn't agree with him, but they went out to listen to him, and that has a real impact. The whole campaign that he run, I think, was a very successful model of how we win back in especially these more rural and districts that are further away from Houston and Austin and San Antonio. So that's the first one that comes to my mind. The other person who I've been looking into a lot more, who I think is really good, is Talarico, who's running for Senate as well. And the reason why I'm really, attracted to him is something I think I've even said it, when I've been with you before. I think Democrats have completely let go the religious side of their messaging and have allowed
Yes.
Republicans to say we are the party of God, which is completely false because God has no party to begin with. But beyond that, if you look at what just 2 days ago, I made a really good video with a clip that the Pope put out. He said, you can't really call yourself pro-life if you're against abortion, but you support the death penalty. You can't be
Yes.
pro-life if you're against abortion, but you support the mistreatment of immigrants in the United States. And when I heard that, I'm like, yeah, that's exactly what I've been saying, for so long now, because the reality is a lot of people, especially Latinos here in Texas, yeah, a lot of our values are guided by religion, and I think Talarico understands that, and he understands that we shouldn't shy away from religion. Instead, if we look at what's going on in this moment through a religious lens, going back to the beginning of the conversation, I, as a Catholic, how can I look at the raid that they just did at an apartment complex
Yeah.
and say, hey, this is okay? No, like goes completely against my values, and I understand the separation of church and state. I mean, I respect everyone's beliefs, but at my core, I can't stay silent, not as a Democrat, but as a Catholic. I can't look at this and say, okay, this is okay. So I think Talarico is really getting it right. And then, especially among Latinos, he's just announced not too long ago Bobby Pulido, who's a very big artist, and now he's running against Monica de la Cruz in the Valley. I think he has a really strong message. I think it's starting to get a lot of steam. It's going to be an uphill battle, but I'm very confident with him. And what I like about him is that he truly understands the Latino community. A lot of times people make generalizations. Oh, they vote Republican because they're this, and that. But I think as someone who grew up in the community, who's worked with the community for many years, he really has his finger on the pulse, and I think he can do really well. And I'm hopeful that he could unsee and flip one of those Republican districts.
You give me hope, Carlos, because I think there are people who get it, and I think they will make a difference. Sometimes at the national level, we look around and we think the entire Democratic Party is Chuck Schumer, but of course, it's the people on the ground, it's the people in the
Mm.
races that really matter. So thank you for coming on again. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for all the work you're doing. You got to keep people engaged and got to keep the hope. And you're always so optimistic, no matter how dark things may seem. And I think it's that love of country that you have that really kind of carries you through. So thank you for everything
Oh,
you're doing.
thank you for having me, and for everyone who's watching. As Joe Biden would say, keep the faith. We got to keep the faith. That's a phrase that always stuck with me. And in the last speeches, that Kamala and Biden gave before they transitioned power to Trump, I think that's like now more than ever. We have to keep the faith. We have to keep going forward, and better days will come, because we have to remember this is a country that's 250 years old, and we're not going to let 4 years of a bad administration ruin a legacy that's so beautiful, that has made this the greatest country on earth. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch and keep working
Amen.
together. Yeah.
Absolutely. Great seeing you again. Take care.
Great seeing you again. Bye.